you know?
Can you explain what America will look like if an EMP hits? What happens to America?
It literally is an apocalypse, an electronic apocalypse. If we're talking about a nuclear EMP attack, and this is a single nuclear weapon detonating over the center of the country, it takes down not just the electric grid, but all the other critical infrastructures also depend upon electricity as well and have electronics in them. Business and finance, manufacturing, communications, transportation, food and water. Well, let me start and put it in more concrete terms. You know, Bill Fortune's phrase, 1 second after.
Yeah.
You know, 1 second after a nuclear EMP detonation over this country, you know, there's about 500,000 people traveling in airliners over the skies of America as we speak, every day, every moment. 500,000 people in over 1,000 airliners. If we're talking about a super EMP weapon, most or all of those are going to come crashing down out of the sky. The electric grid would immediately stop, so there'd be no food and running water. And it's not just like a normal drought, especially in the case of a protracted grid, because there are these things called SCADAs, Supervisory Control and Data Acquisition Systems, that regulate everything. It regulates the way water flows through a pipe, the way natural gas flows through a pipe, the way oil flows through a pipe. And these SCADAs will spark natural gas explosions. Everywhere there are natural gas pipelines, you know, you can expect massive explosions. There's huge concentrations of natural gas pipelines in cities, you know, that would probably cause firestorms in cities. Because the EMP is coupling into the big high power lines, they'll follow those lines because there's nothing to stop the EMP from going right into your house. With a super EMP weapon, you know, it can cause the wiring inside of a house to flash, so you can have houses burned down. Electrical fires started within homes, you know, because they haven't protected the big grid. The big grid is basically an entryway into every individual's home, you know, for the EMP to come and destroy your house and put it on fire and put your family at risk. And that's cars won't start, you know, they would be paralyzed. Trains and automobiles, the kinds of equipment that we have on docks, you know, won't operate, so that you can't offload the goods and services that are coming into America. Communication systems wouldn't work. One of the EMP commissioners, a guy named Lowell Wood, compared it to putting the whole country into a giant time machine and sending us back to the pre-electronic age, back to the 19th century, before there was an electric grid. Mm-hmm. And he was correctly challenged by that, by a smart guy who also advised the EMP Commission called Fritz Ermarth, who used to be the chairman of the National Intelligence Council. You know, when Fritz said, no, Lowell, you're wrong. That's a brave thing to do, because Lowell Wood is like one of the most brilliant scientists in America, and he doesn't like to be told he's wrong. But Fritz argued that it would be even worse than that. You know, because the thing is that in the 19th century America, you know, most of the people were still farmers. 75% of the population lived on farms. Everybody was one generation removed from pioneer stock. So everybody was then what today we would call a survivalist, and would know how to hunt and fish and live off the land. We had a different infrastructure in the nation in those days. We had coal-operated railway lines and horse-drawn wagons that would bring food to market, things of that sort, you know, of horses to do the work. None of that infrastructure exists today, you know. What we do have today is what it would be more accurately like is taking a 21st century society and transporting all those people back to the 19th century and then asking them to survive in an environment that wouldn't be pristine anymore. You know, because the other advantage you had in the 19th century is they didn't have nuclear reactors that had gone Fukushima. Those nuclear reactors, what happens after 7 days, just like at Fukushima, the batteries run out. When in an emergency circumstance, what they first start with is the gas-driven emergency generators, because they've got to keep the cooling pumps running inside of the nuclear reactors, you see. And you run out of gas in about 3 days. Then they go to batteries as the last backup. And as we learned at Fukushima, those will fail in a few days. So overall, you've got about a week of emergency electrical generating power to get the big grid back online to save the nuclear reactors. If the blackout lasts more than a week, the reactors start going Fukushima. And that's not just a problem for the local area. Just like in Japan, which fortunately for them, they're an island, most of the radioactivity got blown out over the Pacific Ocean. But we're not a big island. We're not an island. Most of these reactors are located in the eastern half of the United States, co-located with our population centers. The winds and the weather patterns will pick up the radioactivity and it will carry it over the whole country. So you have 100 and some odd Fukushimas causing radioactive contamination of very dangerous levels that will make recovery and survival much more difficult. And that's just one of the environmental problems. Other more common, one of the things they didn't have in the 19th century that we have today, they had pure rivers and lakes. We don't today, even with all of our efforts. You take your life in your hands if you go to a river or a lake and drink out of it, all right? And we are doing our best to try to clean these up, because we have vast and very expensive hydrotreatment facilities to purify the water, purify sewage, purify industrial and hospital wastes, to clean that up. And all of this is run by vast amounts of electricity. And when the grid goes down, what we know from even normal temporary blackouts is the waste materials back up into the lakes and rivers and streams. We had a situation like this happen in Maryland. And so the dangerous bodies of water that are dangerous to drink from on a normal basis become fatally dangerous, in the aftermath of an EMP because of the spread of these pollutants. So those are just some of the examples. Think of our industrial society is like a gigantic chemistry set. The gasoline that's produced in this country. I don't know if you've ever been to Texas and gone and looked at those big, installations that create our oil and our gasoline and our propane. They're like enormous chemistry sets, and they are just waiting for a SCADA to spark and cause the thing to explode. There are industrial facilities and associated with all of our major population centers like that. And you'd end up with toxic clouds going in, poisonous fires that would basically turn. So that's why Fritz Ermarth said that Lowell Wood was wrong, because it wouldn't be like going back to the 19th century where we would get a chance to be like the Indians again and maybe learn how to live off the land. The land we'd have to live off would be contaminated by radiation. You'd have cities and areas that have been burned down, forest fires from natural gas. Basically a chemical and radiological hell. That would be the consequence of the EMP turning down the grid and causing industrial accidents, wide-scale industrial accidents across the entire country. And we calculated. Now, most people wouldn't die on our calculations from poison or from the radioactivity. Those things could certainly kill tens of millions of people. But even if those things weren't happening, the most fundamental threat is the absence of food and water.
Right.
We only have enough food to feed 210 million Americans for about 30 days. It's in the big regional food warehouses. These are also privately owned. They're not owned by the government. And, we have big regional food warehouses that resupply the local grocery stores. Your local grocery store has about 2 to 3 day food supply on a normal basis. In Washington, when they expect a blizzard coming in, you can see the folly of that because the grocery store shelves get completely stripped from people hoarding the food.
That's right.
And it's only enough for 2 to 3 days. It has to be resupplied. Well, how do you resupply that food when the trucks that carry it don't work because the EMP has destroyed them and transportation systems don't work? And that food will begin to spoil in 3 days because their emergency electricity supply is only enough for about 3 days. And then the food begins to spoil because the food is kept consumable, by refrigerators and temperature control systems and all the complex technology we have. It's the absence of food and water that would kill most people. I guess kind of summing it up, as the EMP Commission report did, an EMP, basically would transform. It would recreate in this country the kinds of conditions that we see in third world countries that experience famines. You know, suddenly there's no food and water and no way to get it to people. Even if our allies, for example, wanted to try rescuing us. I often hear, well, gee, won't the Australians and the Brits come to our rescue and start shipping food to the United States? Well, you know, Australia is a food exporter. Britain is a food importer. But even if you could, even if the Chinese and the Russians decided to take mercy on us and tried to bring their navies to bring food to the United States, you know, we couldn't get the food off the docks, you know, because it relies on high technology, cranes and distribution systems and trucks to distribute it. And that's exactly the problem that we've had, for example, during the Somalia and Ethiopian famines. You know, the United Nations was bringing enough food to feed everybody in Ethiopia and Somalia to the docks. But there was no way to move it off the docks and into the hinterlands because they didn't have a critical infrastructure that was developed enough to get it to where it was needed. And that same condition would come to exist in the United States in the aftermath of an EMP. So starvation, in the end, would be the biggest killer of all. Starvation, including the lack of water. You know, people need water even more than food. Right. And immediately, you know, unless you're on a well, you know, with everybody who lives in a city, you know, depends upon water that's purified and pumped through electrical pumps, and immediately you would have no water.
Right.